Imagine standing on the bank of a river so enormous that the other side looks almost like another world. The water is moving fast. There is no bridge, there is no ferry, there is no motorboat waiting for you. There is no GPS telling you where the safest crossing is. And turning around isn't an option. Your food is with you. Your tools are with you. Your family is with you. You have to get across. So what do? You could try to swim, but one mistake in a powerful current could separate you from the people traveling with you. You could walk into the water and hope it gets shallow, but you don't know what's underneath. Or you could simply stay where you are. But for ancient humans, staying put wasn't always an option. They had to move. They followed animals, they searched for food, they looked for safer land. They explored unfamiliar territory, and sooner or later, they encountered something that looked almost impossible to overcome: a huge river. Today, crossing a river can be so easy that we barely think about it. We drive across a bridge, we take a ferry, we fly over it. We use satellite maps to find the best route. But ancient humans had none of that. And here's the fascinating part. They didn't need modern technology to solve the problem. They watched the world around them. They noticed what floated. They experimented. They made mistakes. They learned from those mistakes. And eventually, they discovered something incredibly simple. The river itself could help them cross it. But before humans built anything that looked like a boat, there was a much simpler discovery. Wood floats. Think about how obvious that sounds. A branch falls into a river. It doesn't sink. It stays on the surface. A larger log does the same thing. And if you were an early human watching this happen over and over again, you might eventually ask a very important question. If a log can carry itself across the water, could it carry me? That question may sound simple, but simple questions can lead to some of the biggest changes in human history. At first, a single log would have been incredibly unstable. You could sit on it, but staying balanced would be difficult. The current could turn it, the log could roll, you could fall into the water. So one log wasn't enough. But what if you put several logs together? Now you have a wider surface. Tie them together with strong vines, plant fibers, or other natural materials, and you've created something much more useful: a raft. It doesn't need to be beautiful. It doesn't need to be fast. It doesn't even need to look like what we would call a boat today. It just needs to do one thing: keep you above the water. And suddenly, the river isn't an absolute barrier anymore. But there was a problem. Floating is only half the battle. Imagine pushing a raft away from the riverbank. For a few seconds, everything seems fine. Then, the current grabs it. The raft starts drifting, and now you're moving. But you aren't necessarily going where you want to go. This is where another major idea enters the story: control. Humans needed a way to influence the direction of the craft. A long piece of wood could be used as a pole, a flat piece of wood could become a paddle, and once people discovered that pushing against the water could move the craft, they had something much more powerful than a floating platform. They had a vehicle, and this is one of the most interesting patterns in early human technology. The first version doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to work. Then someone makes a small improvement. Another person sees it. Someone else changes the design. Another person discovers a better way to steer. And over generations, a simple idea can become surprisingly sophisticated. But crossing a giant river wasn't always about building the biggest boat possible. In fact, bigger wasn't necessarily better. A small craft could be easier to control. A narrow craft could move through certain waterways. Different environments demanded different solutions. Where large trees were available, people could work with wood. Where reeds were abundant, lightweight bundles could be used. In some environments, people could create frames and cover them with flexible materials. The exact design could change. But the principle stayed the same. Find something that can float, make it stable, figure out how to control it, and then use it to move people and supplies. That sounds straightforward, but there's something we haven't talked about yet. What if the river is dangerous? Because not every river is a calm stream. Some rivers are wide, some are deep, some have powerful currents. Water levels can change. Weather can transform a relatively calm river into a dangerous one. And even if the surface looks calm, the water underneath can behave very differently. So ancient humans couldn't simply build a raft and jump into the first section of water they found. They had to learn the river. And that may have been just as important as the boat itself. They could watch the current, they could observe floating branches, they could study the shape of the riverbank. They could look for areas where the water appeared slower. They could search for narrower sections. They could learn from people who had already made the journey. And that last part is incredibly important, because ancient humans didn't have Google Maps, but they had something else: memory. Imagine a group traveling through unfamiliar territory. One person has crossed the river before. Maybe they remember where the water becomes shallower. Maybe they know where the current becomes dangerous. Maybe they know that a certain section is easier to cross during a particular season. That knowledge could be passed from one generation to another. Someone doesn't need a written map to know where to go. The map can exist inside the knowledge of the community, and that knowledge could save lives. Because sometimes the most important part of crossing a river isn't the boat. It's knowing where to cross. Think about it. You could have a perfectly built raft, but if you launch it into the strongest part of the current, you've created a dangerous situation. On the other hand, a simple craft used in a carefully chosen location could be far more effective. That means river crossing wasn't just an engineering problem. It was a problem of observation, planning, timing, experience, and cooperation. And this is where the story gets even more interesting, because ancient humans didn't always try to fight the river. They learned to work with it. A river already has energy. The current is already moving. Instead of trying to overpower that movement, humans could learn how to use it. A floating object naturally moves with the current. A paddle can change direction. A pole can push against the riverbed in shallow water. A sail can eventually use the wind. The river doesn't have to be defeated. It can become part of the transportation system. That's a huge shift in thinking. Imagine looking at a powerful natural force and realizing, I don't need to create this energy, I just need to learn how to use it. That idea appears again and again throughout human history. Humans didn't create the wind, they learned to use it. They didn't create gravity, they learned to work with it. They didn't create rivers, they learned how to travel on them. And once people could move across water, something much bigger began to happen. The river stopped being just an obstacle. It became a route. Think about what that means. A river can provide drinking water. It can support plants and animals. It can provide fish. And once humans develop ways to travel on it, the same river can also connect distant places. A river that once separated two groups can eventually connect them. People can move along it, goods can be transported, new areas can be explored, communities can interact, and suddenly, the ability to cross water isn't just a survival trick, it's a doorway to an entirely different way of living. But moving one person across a river is one thing. Moving an entire group is something else. Imagine a community arriving at a massive river. One person can swim, but what about a child? What about an older person? What about someone carrying food? What about tools? What about animals? And what happens if the group owns more supplies than one person can carry? Now the problem becomes much more complicated. The solution isn't necessarily one giant crossing. It can happen in stages. One group crosses, the supplies follow, the craft returns, more people cross, the process repeats, and suddenly, what looks like an impossible journey becomes a coordinated operation. This is one of the most underrated advantages ancient humans had: cooperation. A single person has limited strength. A group can divide the work. One person can paddle, another can steer, another can hold supplies, someone can watch the river, others can prepare the landing area. The task becomes a team effort. And that ability to cooperate may have been one of the greatest survival technologies humans ever developed. But there was another problem. Not every region had the same natural resources. If you were living somewhere without large trees, you couldn't simply build a massive wooden boat. So humans had to adapt. And this is where their creativity becomes especially impressive. They didn't always ask, what is the perfect material for a boat? They asked a much more practical question. What do we have? If reeds were available, use reeds. If wood was available, use wood. If other lightweight materials were available, find a way to make them useful. The environment became a toolbox, and humans learned to look at ordinary objects differently. A tree wasn't just a tree, it could become a tool. A branch wasn't just a branch, it could become a paddle or a pole. Plant fibers weren't just part of the landscape, they could become rope. A collection of natural materials could become a machine for crossing water, and that way of thinking is incredibly powerful. Because it doesn't depend on having advanced technology, it depends on observation. You look at what exists, you understand what it can do, then you find a new way to use it. But here's something even more surprising. Humans didn't necessarily need to know the science behind floating objects. They didn't need to understand buoyancy equations. They didn't need to calculate fluid dynamics. They only needed to notice what happened. This floats, that sinks. This material is strong. That material breaks. This shape is stable. That shape tips over. Trial and error can teach you a lot. One design fails. You change it. Another design works. You remember it. The knowledge survives. Someone else improves it. And eventually, generations of small discoveries can create technology that looks incredibly advanced. That's how progress often happens. Not in one giant leap, but through thousands of tiny improvements. And rivers may have been one of the places where humans learned this lesson better than almost anywhere else, because the river gave immediate feedback. If something floated, you knew. If it tipped over, you knew. If it moved too slowly, you knew. If it was difficult to steer, you knew. Every journey became an experiment. Every mistake became information. And every successful crossing created knowledge that could be used again. Over time, humans could become specialists. Some people might become better at building watercraft. Others could become better at navigating. Others could remember routes. Others could understand seasonal changes, and a simple survival challenge could eventually become an entire body of knowledge. But let's go back to that original image. A human standing beside a massive river. No bridge, no highway, no motor, no modern navigation, just water. And on the other side, something they need: food, shelter, new territory, a safer place, or simply the next step in their journey. The river looks impossible, but then they notice a fallen tree. They notice that it floats. They begin experimenting. Maybe the first attempt isn't successful. Maybe the raft is unstable. Maybe it drifts. Maybe someone discovers a better way to tie the logs together. Someone else figures out how to steer. Someone else realizes that a different part of the river is safer. And eventually, the impossible becomes possible. That's one of the most fascinating things about our ancestors. They didn't need to understand everything before they started experimenting. They could learn by doing, and that mindset helped humans survive in environments that looked completely hostile. But the story doesn't end with crossing the river, because once humans could cross rivers, they could do something even more important. They could explore what was beyond them. Imagine a river that once marked the edge of your known world. For generations, your community may have stayed on one side. Then someone finds a way across. Now there is new land, new animals, new plants, new resources, new possibilities. The river no longer defines the boundary. Human movement expands, and eventually, water itself becomes a pathway. This is why something as simple as a raft matters. It isn't just a floating pile of logs, it's an idea. The idea that nature doesn't always have to be an enemy. Sometimes nature can provide the solution to its own problem. The river creates the obstacle. The river also provides the surface that allows you to overcome it. And that is a pattern we see throughout human history. Humans face a problem. They observe the environment. They identify something useful. They experiment. They cooperate. And they transform a limitation into an advantage. So, how did ancient humans cross huge rivers without bridges? They didn't have one single method. They used whatever their environment provided. They learned how materials behaved in water. They created simple floating platforms and watercraft. They used poles and paddles to control movement. They studied currents and riverbanks. They remembered safer routes. They crossed in groups, they adapted their technology to different environments, and most importantly, they passed knowledge from one generation to the next. A river that looked like a wall became a road, a fallen tree became a clue, a simple raft became transportation, and a dangerous crossing became an opportunity. But perhaps the most amazing part isn't the raft, it isn't the paddle, it isn't even the river. It's the question that started everything. What if? What if this floats? What if we tie these together? What if we can steer it? What if we cross here instead? What if we use the current? What if we take the whole group? Those tiny questions may sound ordinary, but human history is full of enormous changes that began with questions just like these. And that's what makes ancient survival so fascinating. Our ancestors didn't live in a world without technology. They lived in a world where technology had to be invented from scratch. Every tool had to be discovered. Every shortcut had to be learned. Every safe route had to be remembered. And every obstacle was an opportunity to figure something out. Today, we cross huge rivers without giving it a second thought. We drive across bridges. We watch boats move through the water. We look at maps on a screen. But the next time you cross a massive river, stop for a moment and imagine seeing it without any of that. No bridge, no boat waiting for you. No map, no instructions, just a huge wall of moving water. And then imagine being the person who looks at that river and thinks, there's got to be a way across. That thought may be one of the most important thoughts humans have ever had. Because once we learned how to cross the water, the world became a little smaller, and our possibilities became a lot bigger.